Hello friends. This is Fiction Quest. How are you all? So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto and Boa Hancock were couples in the One Piece verse? But before we start, if you want more amazing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Also, if possible, share this video. Training Ground 9 Naruto was having the time of his life as he gasped for air between fits as he lies on the ground. Who expected a mission with a snobby actress would bring in such joy to his life? Of course she did get her towards the end of the Gumfafa. Something not only ran him over, but his jacket somehow caught onto sandal of the blur. He's being dragged to death. Correction. Was being dragged to death till the blur stopped, disconnected the improvised hook, and lifted the genin onto his back. I'm sorry about that. Kakashi's youthful student. Lee and I were having a most youthful race when I failed to notice you. Would you like me to carry you to the hospital or your home? A second blur became more detailed when it stopped next to the duo. Hello Naruto. How are you on this youthful day? Lee exclaimed. It was then he noticed Naruto's position on his sensei's back. Are we now racing around with added weight to our backs, sensei? You are a genius guy, sensei. Please wait here. With that, Rock Lee leapt into the nearby brush and scrambled to find equal or close to Naruto's projected weight. Naruto chuckled slightly. No, I'm fine. If you can drop me off at the Ichiraku's, then I'll be good to go. And semi-ominous hissing trickled into his ears and his blood ran cold. On second thought, I don't mind helping you two train at all. 10 laps around Konoha minimum? Yes. Two voices cried out, and off they went like a pair of bullets, with Lee tearing his way out of the woodwork with a log hugging his back. A feminine figure dropped out of the trees not too far behind them and gave chase with the abnormally large snake following closely behind. Get back here, Naruto, she screamed. First one to finish will be treated for ramen by me. Naruto yelled with as much vigor as possible to keep his fear at bay. You don't even have money, his pursuer screamed as she tried to catch up with the now energized duo, leaving her to bite their dust. Yes. And if either of us doesn't first, then we will run 20 more laps around Konoha. If we cannot do that, then we will walk on our hands around Konoha for 10 laps, if we. Might Guy's voice easily faded as the distance between the two grew exponentially. The young woman bent over and clutched her knees as she tried to catch her breath when a sudden thought hit her. Wait, are they both going to do their insane claims, or is it just the loser of the race? Hokage's office. Hokage Tower. Tsunade slammed the rubber stamp on the very last parchment that was her bane. Without pause she ripped open a drawer and retrieved the elixir of recreation favored by all drinkers in the elemental nations, as well as a saucer. Without missing a beat she spun her chair and gazed out at Konoha as she poured herself a cup of sake. She barely touched her lips to the drink when she spotted a green and blonde blur being chased by another green blur, which was chased by another green and orange blur accompanied by a fiery orange with a lighter orange blur across the rooftops. Another blur joined in from the streets, followed by a relatively slow-moving snake. The Hokage shook her head and she rolled her eyes at a clock on the wall. Lunch and a show. Better than nothing, she commented to herself. The door slammed open and a familiar rhythm of burdened footsteps resonated from behind her chair. More paperwork, Lady Hokage, Shizune called out. Just 5 more minutes, Shizune. Tsunade whined. Konoha Street corner. Troublesome, Shikamaru said. He observed the fleeing figures near the ramen stand. He didn't need 20/20 vision to see Naruto panicking as the duo were slowing down and the trio behind them were easily catching up. Naruto by himself was a comical nuisance. Just about everyone could agree with that. Ever since the Uzumaki clan was re-established, however, the insanity, as it were, was kicked up by a notch, with public chases much like today's on a bi-monthly basis. They all pretty much ended the exact same way. In front of Ichiraku Ramen, Uncle! Naruto pitifully screamed as he was tackled off the back of Might Guy. The green duo merely watched on from the sidelines before entering the stand to get their orders. Though a little callous, the worst Naruto was going to get out of it was a few lumps and a bruised ego. I give, Naruto squealed as his head was put in the vice that was his sister's hands grinding themselves into his skull. Just because you do not like your ramen stash to be touched does not give you the right to replace all our clothes with your horrible jumpsuits. I said I give. Marigold, Sandersonia, help. Naruto reached out to grab something, anything, to escape the noogie from hell. I don't know, I think we all made it clear that replacing our clothes with those jumpsuits is a crime we all loathe. Yes, I think you'll just have to take your punishment, dear little brother. Mercy. Never, they all shouted. A crowd started to gather on the street to observe the spectacle before them. All 4 members of the Uzumaki clan had gathered. Keeping the infamous, dead last, Naruto in place with her legs wrapped around him like a snake was the oldest of the 4, Hancock Uzumaki of age 16. Standing not too far with slightly malicious grins over the blonde's torture were the younger sisters Marigold and Sandersonia Uzumaki. There were many arguments floating around the family. Who was the clan head? Was this really a clan? Was Naruto Uzumaki really related to Kushina Uzumaki? And for the day, why were they all wearing orange jumpsuits? By the end of the day several facts remained. This was the Uzumaki clan. Whether they were related by blood or not didn't matter to them. Normal has yet to apply to them in any way. No Shori retreat. Those brats are at it again, one person grumbled. Your fault it happened, and you weren't drooling yourself? At least out of the 2 I'm age appropriate. I thought you were in the men and women only camp. Shut up. I wasn't the only one charmed that day by her looks alone. You were the one who blabbed about the boy's inheritance. The man's eyes narrowed. That was Moku, and you were the one who supported that outsider's decision to be an Uzumaki. The female patron directed a smoldering glare at an unassuming waiter merely doing his job. The sheer heat from the glare forced him to a standstill out of fear for his life. The man grinned a little malicious. She does look cute when she pouts though. Shut up, the other patron said through clenched teeth. Ichiraku ramen. The miraculous power of ramen could only go so far to heal the mother of all headaches. It didn't help that Hancock's pet snake, Salome, was watching him like a hawk. Naruto sniffed a little. All he could do is wish that Gama-chan could survive the ordeal. Uzumaki home. And here's the last one. With a small thump, the very last of collective army of orange jumpsuits landed inside a trash bag before it was zipped up and shipped out by an overeager fan. Not too far off was Hancock in Naruto's room with an evil grin as she escaped the confines of the jumpsuit to a purple dress with black snakes coursing through it. Let's see how he likes it when your clothes have been replaced, she spoke barely above a whisper. One by one she had inserted various shirts and pants for both a civilian life and her little brother's shinobi life, all of which were strictly, not, orange. She reached over to grab a pair of blue slacks when she spotted Naruto's pet frog, Gama-chan. Her eyes became slits at the fat frog-themed wallet, which she could swear it was laughing at her. The most they had spent in terms of money, anyone's money on their part, was Naruto's lil stipend to keep him busy at the ramen stand. Being beautiful was both a gift and a curse at times. She smirked. So far there were only 2 people in her life, outside her sisters of course, that weren't swayed by physical beauty, and one of them. Of course she could only account for one. Still. She picked up a pair of pants and placed it inside the closet. A hand began to push one set down the rail holding the clothing up with an eye casually following it. It widened then narrowed once more as it spotted something. An orange something. She plucked it out. Her scowl diminished as her brow furrowed in confusion as she noticed how it appeared beaten, tattered, and had a gaping set of holes riddled along the chest. She sat herself on the bed as she filtered through her memories trying to remember when Naruto was the least bit harmed. So far the only times that came to mind was when he came home from any serious training with his team and the occasional thumping on his skull when he does something stupid, yet this suit testified to a more deadly assault. Her gritted her teeth in frustration. He wasn't seriously injured in the entire time they had known each other since. Realization dawned on her and her lip quavered between the urge to smile as well as frown at the same time. Has it really been a year already? She asked herself. She traced a finger along a hole as a ghost from the past spoke in her ear. I never go back on my word. She smiled softly. Sleep-heavy eyes groggily opened at the insistence of the morning sun. The sun was given a half-hearted glare before being yawned at and ignored by its victim when said victim turned around and covered her head with the blanket. Though she would admit the sun had no fault in all this, but 1, there was a warm bed to lay on, and 2, this was the greatest luxury she has had in years. Can someone please cover the window? A teenage girl's voice groaned out. You do it, you're closer, replied another voice just as weary as the first. Leave it be. The heat's a nice change of things, a third half stated. Mild groans of approval were uttered before the sheets of the bed were rumpled. Outside, someone shouted out what may have been a name or an adjective, followed by the sudden shock made the ship lurch forward. All three girls were rolled out of their beds into a pile. It's too early for this sort of thing. What was that? I think it was that bonehead again. With the same eagerness associated with every rude awakening, the trio soon stormed out the door to investigate, thus revealing themselves to the world. Each one was dressed in near exact copies of closed-toe sandals, scruffy shorts, and tank tops that were once shirts, the former being white while the latter was reddish-brown in color. Both articles of clothing were on the side of being oversized for them. The first was the tallest of the trio, dwarfing them both by a head in both size and in literal size of her own head. Other than height and a block-shaped head, her most distinctive feature was her sea-green hair, not to mention matching eyes, that reached to her shoulders. The second was the second tallest, though by a centimeter or so to the third member. At best she reached the first's chin. Her own hair was similar in length, though a fiery orange, and her eyes were black. The third was, as said, shorter by at least a centimeter or more than the second figure. Her own jet black hair was long as the others, and her own eyes were a dark blue. I think it at least involved the bonehead, the first intoned. From above they observed a pink-haired in a red dress with white circles and borders being chewed out by a sailor, while both were being ignored by a black-haired boy in blue as he leaned over the railing to brood. But what was most interesting of all was a new addition to the ship. A sizable hole that could easily granted passage between the deck and the confines below. Emerging from the darkness below came a gloved yet plated hand, quickly followed by an arm, and subsequently the body of a white-haired man in a green vest and blue clothing underneath, who hoisted up a blonde-haired boy in an orange jumpsuit who they knew seen better days. Yep. He was involved, the second intoned. Not that I don't enjoy a man being put in his place. I have to draw the line when the ship has to be fixed. Both the first and second nodded their heads in quiet unison. The third, however, only stared at the boy as the man who dragged him up tried to coax him into the conscious realm. Ultimately, none of the girls really communicated at length with anyone on the ship save for the pink-haired girl, a leaf kunoichi named Sakura Haruno, but something nagged at her mind when she spotted the boy known as Naruto Uzumaki. It was his voice really that rung some bells, but she couldn't put her finger on where she heard it for the dear life of her. Regardless, sleep wasn't coming back to them anytime soon. Galley, damn brat, a sailor growled as he viciously ate the morning gruel that was breakfast. Accidents were one thing, stupidity was another. They were just lucky that kid didn't go through the hull, or else they were quite literally dead in the water given the temperatures outside. The land of snow, now spring, have radically changed, but the sea bowed to no master short of a god. That, and no one liked to freeze to death. At least no one sane, that is. Nonetheless, it was a moot point, and someone, probably him, was going to have to patch up that hole. Another ship-rocking crash rippled through the ship. Correction. He was going to patch up the holes. With any luck, the damn brat responsible would either be hogtied to the mast, somehow, or forced to help in the repairs, provided that even more patches needed to be made. Shouts, screams, and even wood being crunched all but pierced through the walls of the galley. The entire felt as if it was being tipped over. Crap. Deck. You really think you can escape retribution? Who are these guys? Naruto heatedly asked as he drawn a kunai alongside his teammates in a diamond formation. Just moments before, an iceberg emerged from the ocean and skewered the ship as it forced it to run aground as the glacial behemoth rose up from the depths. Now standing above the crashed ship was 12 shinobi on a makeshift mountain of ice. Does it even matter? Sakura growled. It looks like snow shinobi? Kakashi said. His lone eye narrowed as he spotted a detail he missed. The headbands were slashed. Rogue shinobi, he corrected himself. Every non-shinobi vacated the deck with due haste while the iceberg was turning into island. Please tell me they're not wearing that armor thing, Naruto groaned. For once I agree with the idiot, Sasuke muttered. I hope so too. Sakura cheerily shouted. Sorry to dash your hopes, but they are. Otherwise I would have to guess that this island is a group effort. The sore groans of his students assailed Kakashi's ears. As if on cue, the shinobi descended, a couple by leaps, while the rest either made snowboards from ice or deployed it from some kind of chute from their backs or arms. Each of the boarders drew out a kunai with a tag attached, and launched them at the ship. The ones up above let loose their own kunai by the dozen with their own payloads, much to Kakashi's wide-eyed horror. "Abandoned ship," he cried. Every sailor savvy with fights between shinobi heeded his warning at the drop of a hat, dragging any more novice crew members amongst other civilians with them as they jumped overboard to escape the scene. The shinobi soon followed the sailors' example as the first wave landed with very audible thunks, and their payload erupting with enough force to obliterate chunks of the ship's hull by themselves as opposed to groups. Unfortunately, the shockwaves caused by them, amplified further as the second group landed on the ship's deck, scattered the Leaf Shinobi team before they found purchase on the iced ground below. "Snow, Icefield," Naruto groaned as he groggily got up from the small indent that was his landing. To think Sakura's punches packed a punch. Bones popped, indicated how long he didn't move. With another groan and a grunt, he pops the cricks of his body to a greater extent as he got onto his feet. "Where am I?" he asked himself as he looked around for something, anything, other than ice. So far the closest thing to company, friendly or non, was a hefty chunk of what may have been the ship. With another groan, and a small set of bones that had yet to be popped, he got up and stretched some more while looking about. It was more than obvious that he had no idea where he was, and it was closing in on noon if the sun's position was anything to go by. He sighed. "I suppose there's only way to find everyone." His hands were brought together in a cross-shaped symbol. Shadow Clone Jutsu. Dozens upon dozens of Naruto clones were called into existence. "All right guys, let's go find everyone," the original yelled while pumping a fist in the air. "Yeah. Let's do it." In groups ranging 3 to 5, they all departed in their own direction. Elsewhere, Ga. A third body joined a set of 2 more, each one from Yuki, the village hidden in the snow. Formerly of Yuki, to be exact, given their status as rogues, not to mention the village was possibly going to be renamed much like the land itself. A mixed blessing of sorts to Kakashi. Not only did it mean that there isn't a village after them, but given Yuki's apparent heavy use of chakra armor, they weren't particularly strong by themselves. Then again, he only took out a fourth of the group after them. There was no real way to tell the capacity of the others despite handling them. Combine that to the fact his genin were scattered, it was trouble with a capital T. A strange, almost universal fact about rogue shinobi is that at minimum they were Chunin-level shinobi when they leave their village. Then again, extreme few rogue genin-class shinobi live long enough or become dangerous enough to ever be put into the bingo books. Regardless, Sasuke was skilled, but he was no Chunin. Sakura. He had the decency to cough and scratched his head while look away even though he wasn't talking to anyone. And Naruto. Well, his arsenal was limited to virtually the shadow clone technique. His eye twitched. Now that he thought about it, please tell me I'm not being punished for my teaching methods. The roll of thunder from a cloudless sky was not helpful in the least. Elsewhere, again between a cell and being trapped under one of many remains of the ship, the real difference was the lack of company. Company. That was a light way to put the presence of loathsome men, and the occasional woman, that she had to deal with over the years with her sisters. Unfortunately, it sounded like she would have company soon with the sound of a group approaching her. An orange blur sped past her line of sight, then another, followed yet another. A fourth came by only to slip up. Her brow twitched as she recognized who it was. Bonehead. Otherwise known as Naruto Uzumaki. "Ow!" he groaned as he got up. The careless eye glanced upon the wreckage decorating the landscape, but it focused as it caught sight of the trapped girl, the third of the trio that had boarded the ship with them, pinned by the very edge of what may have been apart the ship's aft middle section, amongst other things that left only her upper body visible. He swiveled his head to shout for his comrades, only to find they had already ran off without noticing his absence. "Jerks," he mumbled as he brought up his hands in a seal. The ship's prisoner gawked as half a dozen boneheads poofed into existence. Her awe turned into confusion, then slightly irritation when they congregated around her, or rather the ship if she was to be precise, and were doing something. What it was, she couldn't tell. Tour into the ship piece by piece after whatever tool or jutsu was employed and empowered out of her sight. The ship's remains creaked and groaned as more of its abused integrity was demolished by something that when slammed into it produced a grinding noise, let alone had a distinct whine to it before its use. Rasengan. A hand curled around a swirling ball of blue light obliterated the deck that was holding her in place, the hand itself emerging but 4 feet away from her left shoulder. 4 feet too close. "There we go," Alright. Push, how he did such work so fast she couldn't figure out, but the results were undeniable, in which she was able to scuttle away from the wreckage that was her prison, although proven temporary. She moved to stand but collapsed onto the iced ground below in a pained hiss when her leg all but screamed in her ears that it wouldn't stand for her. Hey, are you Alri? A hand outstretched to help her was slapped away with vehement poison in both action and in the look she gave the startled Jenin. I don't need anyone's help, especially if it's a man's help, she snarled. She glanced at her own leg. It appeared to be fine, till she tried to move it. She couldn't hide the grimace of agony from anyone, let alone hide it from herself. Hey, just leave me alone, she snarled again. Before she knew it, he was crouching low and scowling in her face. Look here. I don't know what your problem is, and frankly I don't care. You're injured and I am not going to run off knowing that there is somebody injured back here. He leaned in closer till their eyes threatened to touch. Like it or not, I am not going to leave you here to die. Her own eyes widened at the mild rebuke. She wanted to snarl back but she held back. Damn it, she cursed inwardly. He was determined not to leave her be, reasoning be damned. Regardless of the fact he helped her out from the wreckage, he was, for all intents and purposes, a man. A boy actually, but a man nonetheless. Who was there to say he couldn't betray her or abandon his ideals when push comes to shove? Yet her bum leg. Then there was her sisters to think about. Were they all right? Are they captured by some crook looking for a pretty penny if nothing else? The icy hand of fear clutched at her heart. She had no choice if nothing else. Slow down, damn it, hissed his agitated injured passenger, who had made no effort to hide her disdain for him, his gender, and his ability in carrying her and her injured leg around in a stretcher made out of hanged clones assisted by another while the real one lead the stretcher. It's not my fault this place is so jagged, Naruto grouched to himself. I heard that. You're just making excuses. If she could, he would have heard the twitching of an eyebrow in growing annoyance as the thought of leaving her steadily became a very handsome idea. But there was his Nindo. And he gave his word to help Boa Hancock, as she was named, as well as find her missing sisters. Sometimes it sucked to be a good guy, as it would seem. Overall their trek could be going better, but with a broken leg or at least an injured one, Naruto had little choice but to walk slowly as the terrain would permit. Uphill too, no less, amongst other things. All things considering, the slope was rather gentle, yet had its challenges with unexpected pitfalls and cracks that lay hidden in the icy hill, but they continued nonetheless if they were to have some chance to find Naruto's teammates or Hancock's sisters. Almost mercifully for the beleaguered Jenin, they had reached the top, and both the original and the clone positioned themselves to allow Hancock a view of the valley below. Her attention was drawn to the blonde-haired boy when his head turned to eye her. She saw his jaw open to say something, but the voice was not his own. Naruto's home. End flashback. Naruto's room. Uzumaki compound. Hancock shook in startled fright and swiveled her head to view Sandersonia peeking inside from the doorway. Her eyes bulged to find a remnant of the army's worth of orange jumpsuits Naruto all but refused to get rid of. By choice. The eldest of the sisters stiffened as she heard the faint creaking of the front door being opened and a greeting from their younger brother to announce his arrival. Acting on a hunch and a small bit of fright of being caught in his room, Hancock brought a pair of fingers to her lips and lets forth a shrill whistle. The results were instantaneous. With a thud, Naruto's complaint soon echoed into his room. Come on, Salome, get off me. Hancock, Salome won't get off of me. Naruto complained from the foyer. The two found in his room merely snuck out, quietly shut the door, and snuck off to another to leave Naruto none the wiser about their presence in the house. Hancock? Sandersonia? Marigold? Anybody? They infiltrated and closed the door of Hancock's room with an inaudible "C," yet Sandersonia clasped both hands around her mouth to mute the giggle emanating from it. It quickly died when Hancock took to her bed as a chair with the jumpsuit in question. At first it died down out of aggravation to find one of Naruto's jumpsuits surviving the purge, but slowly turned to an unspoken worry as she noticed the details she missed on the first glance. The suit had seen better days, that was for certain. The bittersweet smile of Hancock did nothing to quell the dread suspicion in her. Say, do you remember the day you actually met Naruto? Huh? Sandersonia intelligently said as she tilted her head in confusion. The smile never left the eldest's face as she turned to the younger before resuming the conversation. Remember? When we actually met him rather than watched him? As if to emphasize her question, the jumpsuit's holes were brandished more broadly in the light of the room. Sandersonia's head tilted as her puzzlement only grew as the cogs of her mind whirred and meshed together, till the results were manifested. Flashback. Cavern. Hold still, you little punk, bellowed a rogue shinobi of Yuki as he pursued Naruto. A Naruto at least, given that there was a number or close to the number of 20 of the orange-wearing genin jumping around. His attention was too focused on a single one, possibly the one, to notice a pair of the blondes behind him, with one of them helping form a ball of swirling blue energy in the palm of the other. All the while two sisters got reacquainted over the heat of the battle behind an outcropping of ice. Thank the gods you're alive. Are you hurt? Is it a sprained ankle? Sandersonia spouted amongst other worried questions. I'm fine. The only thing that truly bothers me at this point is that knuckle-headed brute. Hancock gave out as a union of a growl and of pain. Rasengan. Gah. The resounding crash into the side of the cavern did little to help Naruto's case in the eyes of the two Boa sisters. Ha ha. That's what you get for messing with Naruto Uzumaki, believe it. Please tell me he isn't this energetic, Sandersonia crooned. Unfortunately he is. Ice, snowfield, Chidori. A lightning-coated hand pierced through a wall of ice, but the real target wasn't there. Ice release. Dread spear. With a swivel of the head, Sasuke's Sharingan witnessed the javelin seeking his life, to which he flipped away from and landed in a crouch, only to roll forward to avoid the arm blade of another shinobi trying to slay him. He humphed as he cracked his neck at the new arrival to his skirmish. Where is everyone? Sakura mumbled to herself as she started to climb the side of a hill with a gentle slope. For Kakashi, he could breathe a little easier knowing that the rogue team sent against him is now at half strength. However, that was cold comfort. So far none of his opponents showed any real skill as a shinobi. They relied on their armor too much for a jutsu offensive where other skills could be useful. They were especially weak in the department of taijutsu. However, there is still a sizable chance that the others were their superiors in some function, and anything can and most likely will happen if given a chance. So far he only encountered a total of 6 shinobi originating Yuki, but no one else. Not his team. Not the ship's crew. Not any of the other passengers of the ship. Not even a bird. Smack. Mosquitoes, somehow alive despite the temperature notwithstanding. Ow. Yuki base camp, oof. A sailor grunted as he was shoved into a carved pit with a number of his companions and some of the passengers of the wrecked ship. Excuse me, sir, but what's the point in? The shinobi in question never finished his sentence when ice encased his body long before he knew his end had come. The only other member of the group of rogues, aside from the one sitting on block of ice in a long billowing cloak of dark purple regality, kept his own distance and chose not to speak a word as the hands of the cloaked one balled into fists. Bleeding hearts like theirs will ultimately lure them here, the cloaked man answered heatedly as he glared at a figure only perceivable to him. Mountainside. Can you be any rougher? Sandersonia chided as the pair of blondes ferried her sister along the rough pathway leading to the valley below. Hey. It's not easy with all this jagged ice and stuff. Not to mention we could be attacked at any given moment. A Naruto rebuked. Then wouldn't it be easier to defend against an attack from higher ground? Sandersonia stated, more than questioned in a half-heated growl, joined in by the grunt of approval from Hancock. Both Narutos twitched at that, with enough force to even jerk their heads to the side. Yeah. He shakily replied. But, he suddenly added, this path where one only leads to that cave I was fighting in earlier. It was the sisters' turn to twitch at being bested by who they deemed dim-witted. It was then things got hectic. Naruto, with eyes closed as he laughed in victory, stubbed his toe on an outlying and unyielding piece of ice. Overwhelmed by the sudden onrush of pain, he let go of the stretcher to grab at his rising foot in an immediate attempt to alleviate the pain. Upon realizing what he just downed in onset horror, he twists about in the same spot and lurches downward to grab the falling end of the stretcher, only for gravity to take him and have him slide down the icy walkway. In a bid to stop the potential crash of the stretcher, his hands were brought up in a T-shaped hand seal as he slid away, which conjured another Naruto into existence, which did grab the stretcher. Hey, watch it, you bonehead, yelled Hancock in an enraged yet frightened fashion. Sorry, I just gravity ensnared the clone too. Followed by both Hancock and the only other clone if the stretcher was to be excluded. Ah. During which, The real Naruto groaned as he managed to climb out of a bank of snow. Unfortunately, it was the same time he realized his clones and his passenger were also coming at him at inhumane speeds. Ah crap. Crash. You idiot. Bonk. Ow. Sandersonia, standing aloof, gazed on a one-sided fight between her older sister and the orange-wearing blonde with an unhinged jaw. He's supposed to be protecting us? She deadpanned. In a small plateau of the valley between a wall of ice and cracked slopes that bordered a sizable pathway, a cry was heard. Go slower, you boneheaded imbecile. Aren't those two synonyms? The one good foot the crippled teenager had smashed into the back of the blonde's head. Ow. Will you please stop that? The foot kicked the back of his skull once more, followed by an indignant, haughty, HRMMPH. Okay. That is it. He bellowed as he came to an abrupt stop that jostled the stretcher, especially when the clone at the other end stumbled slightly at the sudden halt. In a near instant he somehow reversed his grip as he seemingly teleported in his spot to face the injured girl without losing his hold over the stretcher. Their faces would have been separated by inches if psychics wasn't an issue on many a level. I honestly don't get you. What is it that I have done to you to deserve this treatment? Hancock's eyes narrowed to slits as she hissed her reply. You keep taking us over rough terrain that keeps bumping this half-baked stretcher. You keep acting like a smart aleck. And worst of all is that you're a man. If the venom in her voice was meant to cripple in some fashion, it only made him angrier instead. You know what? Fine. If you don't like it, then fine. Both Naruto and his clone, the latter seemingly confused for reasons unknown, set the stretcher of hanged clones down, and the former stormed off to an outcropping of icy boulders and jutting fissures. Where are you going? Sandersonia roared at the retreating blonde while the clone of the boy wandered to the side to avoid being caught in the crossfire. To cool off, what else? Naruto barked back as he climbed one of the boulders and jumped onto a higher standing one which he claimed as a seat to sulk. Useless sack of. Hancock snarled as she slammed her balled fist in a fit of rage, and winces horribly when her strength proved enough to disrupt the concentration and power of the clones that had supported her up to this point. Damn it. She hissed through clenched teeth when her injured limb bounced slightly from the half-inch-long drop. Sandersonia was at her side in an instant. Unruly brute, she growled as she tentatively tended to the limb with no visible injury. But while Sandersonia's boiling aggravation was aimed towards the brooding blonde sitting crossed-legged with a fist smashed against his chin, Hancock's own irritation was aimed within. While it's easy to direct her annoyance and hostility begot from it on the very manifestation of her hate, though didn't quite fit the role, she couldn't help but feel a minute pang of guilt. Something about the genin reminded her of something, but no matter how hard she tried, her mind continued to fail what he reminded her of. She definitely heard his voice before, but where? The voice alone wasn't even a reason to get her goat, it was the question that ran through her mind each time he spoke. Why is his voice familiar? No answer came to her as of yet, and it only served to infuriate her as she tore through her mind more and more to find the answer. Sandersonia. Hancock. Two heads pivoted and even smiled peacefully as the third of the sisters came running, her arm waving frantically as a blissful gaping smile featured itself on her lips. They were reunited at long last. Crack. Everyone's attention turned to along the high valley wall where three dragons of ice sprouted from it and roared like the beasts they were, despite of course being animated ice. In a dreadful swoop, all three descended on the sisters at speeds beyond terminal velocity and scooped them up in stubby limbs equipped with claws. Neither the real Naruto nor his clone had a chance to grab onto the constructs as they climbed back to their place of origin, or more specifically the cliff that overshadowed the mountainous side and the one that stood atop of it. Hey! Let them go, you bastard! Naruto screamed as he tried to give chase, yet the ascent of the constructs of ice had already carried both the sisters and themselves beyond his reach long before he reached a fourth of the way from his spot. The distance was too great for all but the most phenomenal of chakra-enhanced jumps. From above, the shinobi controlling the ice dragons took his time to bend the ice around him to his will. Apparent golems and cages of ice were formed. Damn it! He hissed as he charged to the first natural ramp he spotted. Coast. They say planning for the future before a battle is bad luck. All things considered, Kakashi wasn't concerned by that. For one reason, he wasn't planning before an engagement, per se at least, and for a second reason, he wasn't in a battle. Per se, given the lack of skill from what he faced so far. At the very least he had no immediate concerns. Sans finding his students, of course. It was the realities of what happens afterward, when the rogue shinobi are subdued, that was of concern in Kakashi's mind. Their ship was ruined and there wasn't nothing but ice all around. Cold. Frozen. Solid. Water. Smack, and mosquitoes for reasons beyond him. Carving a ship out of from the ice could possibly work. It was also likely it would melt long before they made it to a rock, no matter how thick they made the hull. Not to mention sailing such a craft would be an issue by itself. Building one from scrap or even from the wreckage was obviously out of the question, lest they have a riot on their hands if they managed to make so much as a cumbersome smaller craft of the once behemoth, which in itself would hold much less people than the original ship. With any luck the iceberg that was the island was already drifting towards a shipping lane, but he wasn't holding his breath on that. And no ships were in sight. Just great, Kakashi groaned as he rubbed the side of his face bearing his good eye. Kakashi-sensei. The man jumped slightly with the abrupt turning of his head to spot Naruto running toward him as fast as his legs could carry him, his face red from exertion. "Hey Naruto, how are you?" He spoke casually as he gave the heaving, hunching genin with hands on his knees for support a smile with the use of his visible eye. The latter threw his held up, unconcerned about his appearance. "I need your help, sensei," he yelled uncontrollably in his breath-strained voice. "Some bastard just made off with Hancock and her sisters." Kakashi turned to fully face him and held up his hands to placate the distraught boy. "Calm down, Naruto. Take a few deep breaths and tell me who you were talking about and what happened." End flashback. Uzumaki compound. "I'm still stuck here. Come on," Naruto cried wearily as he continued to wriggle his way out. Movement drew his eye to one of the corners and her growled in annoyance. "I saw your hair, Marigold. Can you please get Salome off of me?" He didn't receive an answer. "You guys aren't still mad about this morning, are you?" Silence. Growl of a hungry stomach notwithstanding. "This is cruel and unusual punishment, you know." He hung his head and let loose a bone-tired sigh. "Can you guys at least get me a bowl of ramen and a pair of chopsticks? I'll figure something out." Elsewhere, while paying half-minded attention to the whining squall of her adoptive brother, Marigold stuck her head into Hancock's room. "Why do you have Salome pinning Naruto down?" Her confusion, slightly stained in worry now, only grew when she spotted the tattered and ragged jumpsuit belonging to the squirming blonde in question. Whatever answer that was dealt fell upon deaf ears belonging to a busied mind. Flashback. Yuki Base Camp, Iceberg Island. "I guess this teaches me for turning my back on Naruto," Kakashi mentally grunted as he locked blades with a more worthy adversary of the rogue shinobi while his student tackled the man that was their antagonist of their latest mission, Dodo Kazahana. "You will pay for your insolence, you petulant brat," the former ruler of the land of snow bellowed as he forced a dragon of blackened ice to barrel through a horde of clones. He was a man of blockish features with an enlarged nose to match. His hair was a darker shade of brown compared to most, and the armor he wore was reminiscent to the armor he worn in the last encounter he had with the child. The broken section over the left side of his ribs, however, proved that it was not of the same quality, nor of the same power of his previous suit, as he had used 2 hands to make individual ice dragons to be used as missiles as opposed to one. "Yeah right, you bastard. Now give up and release everyone you have hostage," Naruto barked as he and several other clones charged with drawn kunai. "Never. Ice release. Forest of Spears." The former daimyo slammed a fist into the ground and willed a quagmire of pointed ice barbs awaiting its charging victims. They only ran around it. Ice release. Black hail. With his comparatively limited power, Dodo turned a scooped-up handful of crushed ice and lobbed the darkening ice at a horde of the clones, which tore them to shreds. His attention, however, turned too late to handle the other wave of attackers who were only hastened in retaliation to Dodo's assault. From a trio of ice-bound cages, the collective eyes of the Boa sisters only watched on as the Naruto clones, and presumably the genin himself, dog-piled the man in a mass of jabs, kicks, and stabs, only to be repelled with a pillar of the black ice shot through the collection of blondes and even dispelled a number of them. No word was spoken between them, nor replied to the crew of the wrecked ship still trapped in the pit when their continuous cries continued to ask for details of the world above. As for Kakashi, his hand was coated in lightning which broke through a shielding of ice and even bit into the armor of his opponent. Naruto, the real one, landed with a pained grunt at a sizable distance between the ex-daimyo and the hostage sisters. A pained but determined fist clenched tightly and pounded against the ice as he climbed back onto his feet with a trail of blood seeping down his chin from his mouth. "Give up." Dodo ordered from afar. "You are no match against me. You were only lucky the last time we faced each other." "Hey." Naruto held his kunai aloft as a grin. "Keep telling yourself that, you jerk." A small pit was carved into the ground beneath Dodo's right fist, which he brought up to the same level, sitting just beneath his shoulder, his fist encased in a swirling mass of cone-shaped icicles blackened with malice. "Then the price of your treachery against the true lord of the land of snow falls upon your head." He brought his swirling ball back as he would throw a normal punch, and theirs. Even with the threat of the icicles now launched at him, the genin swerved his head back and gawked to find the sisters sitting in the ice cages behind him and backed all the way back in mild but heavily strained hope to escape the assault unharmed. Even from afar, it looked like they expected the worst to happen despite the small bid to protect themselves. He didn't even need to know how to read lips when the sisters turned to each other and say farewell with eyes laden with non-existent tears. The blonde hands came together in the one-hand seal that became his trademark by those who knew him. Multi-shadow clone jutsu. How many clones came into being was unknown, and it wasn't from the sheer number alone, it was the amount of smoke that marked their conjuring that concealed their number. The smokescreen only grew in size with the hail of icicles seeking to spill blood tearing into the army of clones. Ice release. Rasengan. Dodo's cry of anguish permeated the air, followed quickly by a heavy-set crash that destroyed the spot of impact for wherever the man landed, and the sisters dared approach the edge of their cages in an attempt to see through the dissipating but heavy cloud of smoke that blocked the view of the battlefield. "I want you to remember this till the day you die, you jerk," Naruto cried out from beyond the veil. Naruto Uzumaki doesn't give up. Even from a distance, they could hear the thud of a body dropping, which only coaxed them to press their faces between the bars to see the scene. For Hancock, however, she was actually trying to force her head through, either consciously or unconsciously, as dawning fell upon her, egged on from a quote of her recent past of over a week ago. "If you give up, your dreams, and everything else, will end right here." The haze began to clear enough for the oldest sister to whisper one word. One wish of rejection of the scene before her. One word laced with the fears of one seeing tragedy, which rendered them unable to do an act as simple as breathing. No. Naruto Uzumaki, the knucklehead that aided them so far, was on his back with half a dozen icicles digging into his chest. His life wasn't in danger anymore by so much as an imagined threat, but that reason wasn't enough to force the raven-haired teenager from Naruto's bedside as she stared off into space with a comatose Naruto never leaving her blank sight. No medical personnel, for the body or mind, could get her to leave. Her sisters didn't even try. All attempts have failed, and those who partook in them were sent off as flustered, sputtering, blushing heaps of what they once were by the power of an all-too-sweet smile and a small but childishly cute plea to stay. Even Kakashi Hatake fell victim to Hancock's selfish ploy. Sasuke didn't even try to make an effort altogether, let alone Sakura. The only ones that held any significance to Hancock, outside of her sisters and Naruto Uzumaki for the time being, were the doctors and nurses that came into the room to check the genin's vitals, change the IV bags, and other duties expected for a patient expected to wake up any day, as well as bring in necessities to the trio of sisters that all but lived in said patient's room. Few things other than those collective four held anything worth batting an eyelash at, and that was including the omnipresence of time. The only things Hancock could concern herself with for the time being was the distinct characteristics of the leaf genin in front of her, with only half a mind in doing so, during which her other half was devoted to another duty. A more strenuous duty. A migraine-inducing duty from the conglomerate of trouble that threatened to have her snarl at those undeserving of the act, throw up the building bile from the lowest pits of her stomach, and rack her body with a shudder of evils past that were barely held back, all to remember a voice. A voice labored with pain and exhaustion, but till held conviction in its defiance. "If you give up, I'm sure it'll be quite a relief. No one will bother you, or even pay attention to you." It was all right, but it was still really painful. I felt there was no place for me in this world. But I have good friends now. And when I tried my best and didn't give up, good things happened. If you give up, your dreams, and everything else, will end right here. They were not meant for her. Not for Boa Hancock. They were meant for another. They were meant for the one Dodo loathed for her connection to his bloodied throne and had locked away in the dungeons that was his castle. Yet, she felt a certain warmth of a fire long thought to have been put out. A hope given to the downtrodden from another of their kin who spoke no lie nor held a false hope by the burning will to improve his life and the life of others. Yet at the same time no help came for the Boa sisters, also prisoners and slaves of the man who once lorded over the fortress that was his domain. At least not until the battle brought to it was over with. With that in mind came a question molded from wretched experience. Are you just another man railing against what you don't like, or are you something else entirely? No answer had been reached as of yet by a hesitant mind and a body still recovering from what should have ended his life. Neither sister gave any aid in the matter as they sorted out their own troubles, though not unlike Hancock's. Stirring from the blonde-haired boy stole her attention as his body squirmed to find new comfort by order of arousing consciousness made evident from a pair of bright blue eyes groggily peeked out from under the flaps of skin that protected them. Silence was all that stood between the two, punctuated only by grunts from the latter as his mind slowly took in his surroundings with a weighted mind. At least that was the only explanation Hancock could conceive, with just waking up and giving only her sisters and herself a mere glance, and the eye that cast it only showed interest in a cup of water awaiting him. It was given to him as a concession from sister's part, by Marigold's hand to be precise, for his subjective risking of his life when his hand proved unable to grasp it. Upon quenching his thirst, his spirits seemed to return to their former glory, though marred by the lethargy of being inactive for so long. He even finally seemed to have taken notice of the trio as well, after a quick look around the hospital room to confirm his growing suspicion of where he was. Blues settled into an unmoving set of charcoal that bore into them in a silent argument with itself. "Why did you do it?" Hancock asked him in the same manner as if she was scolding him, for being the gender she made no effort to hide her disdain from. Twin blonde brows furrowed in confusion, further confirmed as he released a "huh" at Hancock as a non-understanding frown graced him. "Why did you take those icicles? Don't you have some kind of defense jutsu?" The frown of Naruto Uzumaki increased only by a fraction as he could have sworn her voice raised slightly near the end as something else cracked through. "No. And it was the only thing I could think of to keep those icicles from getting past me." A twitch had struck across her right eye, yet as quickly as it had appeared it had disappeared fast enough to make the blonde wonder if he had been seeing things. "Are you saying that because we were behind you, you choose to receive bodily harm to ensure that we didn't get harmed?" Yeah." Hancock's face went neutral in secluded thoughts. "Unbelievable," she finally muttered. Amongst other things she cradled her face in her palm. "Huh. You could say we're more accustomed to men favoring themselves rather than others," Sandersonia offered reluctantly after leveling a placid eye on him. The blonde's face scrunched up in a scowl. "I don't know what kind of lives you three had, but know this." He jutted a thumb at himself. "I promised that I would help and protect you, and I never go back on my word. That's my Nindo. My shinobi way." Hancock, during Naruto's rant, finally peered up again from her own clutch with the barest hinting of a smile threatening to break loose upon her as he dared a thought in her head. End flashback. Uzumaki compounds slender fingers gently, tenderly, and tentatively caressed the relic of a time past and probably kept to remember it as the clock took its course. "We never really got off on the right foot when we met him, now did we?" the eldest sister asked lowly as her mind continued its trip through memory lane with only half a mind devoted to the world as it is. "Well, you could say your foot made an impression." With the back of his skull. All three gave in to an embarrassed giggle of benign amusement with a small hint of regret lacing through Hancock's own chuckle. Even when stricken with the giggle, she eventually relinquished control of the jumpsuit and let it fall into the clutches of her sisters as she leaned back and stared at her surroundings, walls and the ceiling they encompassed, her mind adrift once more. "Hallway. I think my legs are asleep," Naruto grumbled as he stared at the end of the hallway in annoyed hopelessness. Even after Salome had fallen asleep some time before, his grip of the genin had yet to diminish in any such form. "I just had to get the idea to get her a pet snake. I knew I should have gone with the toad, but no," he griped. The growl of a hungry stomach soon present to all capable of hearing. "Yep. Should have gone with the toad. Forested road, land of fire, 4 days after leaving Koro." From a distance most would say Hancock's eyes were just as black as Sasuke Uchiha's, yet on closer inspection they were in fact dark blue. It was a fact only Naruto seemed to have noticed, where everyone else seemed to have not consciously acknowledged or cared, as the case may be. In any event, This detail went unnoticed by the Uchiha Avenger as he and the head of the Boa sisters squared off in a half-lidded staring contest of heated proportions. As to what led to this event, only those two knew while everyone else was left in the dark. As mysteriously as it started, it was broken off with both parties suddenly jerking their heads away with a respective huff from both parties followed shortly by a glare aimed at each other. Only Hancock's glare that consisted of slits for eyes. 2 hours later, due to the brilliant plan that was Naruto's strategy, he only had one of his jumpsuits at his disposal, whereas underclothing was abundant. As such, his whole garments were his only means of decency. Outside, his underwear and shirt were the only thing keeping him decent outside of his sandals as he sat himself on the ground and stared at his outstretched hand that was held tightly at the wrist by his spare hand. "Come on," he lowly coaxed. In his palm, a familiar spiral pattern of chakras swirled into existence. "Hey Naruto," and there it went as quickly as it appeared with just as much evidence of its leave as its arrival. "Gah!" Naruto cried. "I just had it too," he wailed as he furiously tore both hands through his golden hair. In his frustrated sorrow he fell onto his back and rolled around uncontrollably as he continued to vent in aggravation with closed eyes. "Why must this technique be so hard to learn again? I can do it with a clone. But what kind of Hokage would I be if everyone else can use it with only one hand?" "Naruto." Stopping suddenly on his back, the blonde at last opened his eyes in hope of gazing upon the original reason to his latest failure of forming a Rasengan with but one hand as opposed to three, if his clone's hands were to be counted, of course. "Hey, who turned out the lights?" he quizzically asked in genuine curiosity. The world as he knew it was cast in darkness, though what was with the small horizon of light near the ground every which way he turned his head where his cheek would be flush with the ground. And why was the horizon shaking slightly along the top of the band of light? "Wait. Oh. You pervert." Wham! Every bird, squirrel, and even acorns were jostled out of whatever tree a 12 to 13-year-old boy was jettisoned to and fled for their lives. At least the birds did in a more noticeable fashion, at least between their panic tweeting and from the fact that they climbed as high into the skies as fast as their wings could take them. Kakashi just lazily turned to the next page of his book. His mind had long since chalked this occurrence up as a poorly thought-out stunt, most likely accidental by nature, on Naruto's part. Hancock storming away with exasperated huff and reddened cheeks, in a newly acquired dress gained from the last town they stayed in no less, only served to solidify the current theory of Naruto doing something brainless. "Naruto." Sakura growled as she raised a trembling fist. With a resigned sigh, the only jonin, and adult for that matter, closed his book. "Better save Naruto," he mumbled. Even he doubted Naruto's ability to survive between Sakura and undoubtedly whatever the sisters would come up with upon learning would ever set Hancock off. Sometimes it was downright troublesome to be a jonin sensei. There was hardly time to read any more between the missions, training, and occasionally saving Naruto from the wrath teenage girls who, in majority at least, have ninja, training, rumble. With a collective bead of sweat threatening to drop from him due to the trepidation of what he suspected, he hesitantly turned toward the cloudless sky. 5 days later, reaching Konoha just couldn't happen soon enough for Kakashi as he snapped his book shut once again, much to his dislike. While he certainly had expected some degree of trouble as her served as an instructor, his experience and knowledge of such a fact drawn from his own discretions in the past, but he was certainly treading in new territory, for him at least, as he went to save Naruto, again. In the past few days his team's ability to work exactly as they're called, a team, essentially went to hell when Naruto had taken upon himself the duty of apologizing to Hancock for whatever transgression he had originally incurred. That went as well as walking into the shower first thing in the morning, having just gotten up from bed, and learning firsthand the water heater was out of order. Of the noteworthy beatings he had to rescue Naruto from in the short period of time that made this trip insufferable for his reading time, there was the time he accidentally walked into the girls while they were bathing at a creek, trying to assuage the current moods with gifts consisting of poison ivy made into armlets, and getting the idea of asking Sasuke for help. That only made things worse for reasons beyond the jonin. Sighing heavily, the man stretched out an arm without looking to catch an unconscious blonde that rocketed through the air. "What did you do this time, Naruto?" he asked rhetorically. As if to answer, a toad smacked into the genin's face with a croak of agony spilling into the air from both the impact to the blonde's face and the subsequent fall to the ground. "Okay. I'm not even going to guess, the silver-haired man grumbled as he rubbed his own face. By whatever power Naruto ran on besides ramen and at times chakra given by an outside source, the Nine Tails included, the Boa sisters had gotten it into their minds to follow Kakashi's team back to Konoha. However hesitant they were regarding the male-to-female ratio Team 7 already had, with a slightly more tolerable disposition towards the blonde himself even in the current war, as it were. Between the obligations of being a gentleman to poor women down on their luck and the fact that Naruto would most likely raise whatever hell there was to be raised, the Jonin had to accept this. But with things going as they were, it may as well take a month to get back where it would take a couple of weeks at the most. There was only one method he had at his disposal to in any way end this debacle. Get off the road and head into the nearest town, village, or city if that was the case. Whether or not this would succeed in some form could only be ascertained by performing the act. At the very least it might cool their passions down long enough for some semblance of order to be established once more when everyone was distracted by whatever marvels the town, village, city. Frankly, any significant gathering of people. Provided that said people didn't want to kill them, of course, that was a given. Now where's that map? He mumbled to himself as he dragged Naruto through the air with nary a thought given to him. Stupid little orange nutcase. Hancock muttered lowly as she applied a brush to her hair as a means to calm her angered nerves brought on by the latest asinine plot Naruto cooked up. A mild curse went through her mind as the want for a mirror haunted her with each stroke of the brush. Sister, Marigold cooed, why do we have to follow these people? Granted, Bonehead saved our lives, but certainly we're not obligated to go to this Konoha place, Sandersonia added. The brush stopped in mid-stroke. This was not the first time this issue was brought up. They weren't bound by chains any longer. They were free. They could go anywhere they desired. The brush continued its repeated pace. I'm just indulging that idiot's whim, nothing more, she stated. A frown, however, marked her lips as a thought once again crept through her mind and gave her chills. What happens next? She stroked her hair all the more passionately as she tried to blot out the question. Thoughts of the future never did play out well for her or her sisters. Sasuke's hand almost reverently skimmed along the edge of a tree abused by the most peculiar of ailments to strike a living being. Petrifaction. The state in which a substance turned to stone. Courtesy of a chakra-fueled kick from Hancock. He only knew this by the chance discovery of a late-night stroll to alleviate the recent nightmares involving his older brother. She was no kunoichi by any true standard, but it was obvious she was trained enough to utilize chakra for whatever purpose that training was brought on about. In all likelihood it was to use this bizarre yet deadly ability to bring down whatever foe that was unlucky enough to be hit. Of course, in being honest with himself, Sasuke actually thought it was something of a hoax when he stumbled across the teen as she practiced simple kicking on a tree they had long since left behind. He just waited till whatever method Hancock used was revealed to his Sharingan eye. But as time passed, a new theory presented itself to him. Kekkei Genkei, bloodline limit. Unfortunately, by the time this hypothesis came to mind, Hancock seemed paranoid enough to limit her excursions into the night as well as keeping an eye on him where she could. If she actually knew he was spying on her as of late, she had yet to reveal it. As for her sisters, either they weren't as interested in becoming in any way effective of using this possible bloodline limit, or they seemed to lack the traits needed to use it, like Tsunade of the Senju clan for example, not to mention some of her kin before they died. Even some members of the Uchiha clan weren't even able to use their own bloodline abilities for that matter, much to Sasuke's regret regarding it. So that left Hancock as his subject of study for the time being. But with her vastly decreased frequency of training, if he could call it that, it seemed impossible to determine if it was a bloodline at work or not, under not only the circumstances behind his method of research, but from the lack of any form of education into a medical or forensic field to learn the truth of the matter. Of course, his minute hopes of learning the truth were resurrected when opportunity came knocking in the form of his teammate. He couldn't help but smirk both then and now as he turned his greatest hindrance into possibly his greatest hope to date. Who knew Naruto being annoying would actually help me, he muttered quietly. Stupid Sasuke, Naruto mumbled with squinted eyes as he more or less navigated his way through the crowds of Josu's streets. So far, making amends of any kind had backfired to say the least, and he was more than certain that calling those three ridiculous in their grudge against him wasn't going to help him at all. He wasn't stupid. He suddenly came to a halt with a twitching brow as he suddenly reflected on his past. Okay, I'm not that stupid. He quietly amended before resuming his advance with a scowl and a pout in one expression. Hot sauce sucks anyway, he grumbled once more as he unwittingly passed Kakashi as he resumed his reading. I'm not going to ask, the Jonin mumbled as he turned the page. Now what to do? Naruto uttered as he came to a stop in a relatively secluded corner of the marketplace. There were numerous stands and shops clustered here. Perhaps he could buy something to get them to cool off. He heard that worked, didn't see how though. Of course, with things as they stood, chances were that may be the only route he could take at this point unless he was willing to be tossed out a window. Again. With a groan, Naruto dug into his pocket to fish out Gama-chan, a somewhat emancipated Gama-chan that had yet to recover from his time with Jiraiya. Greedy jerk, the blonde grumbled as he checked his current amount of cash. A few ryo amounting to roughly 500 or so if he was to guess from the uncounted coins, much to Naruto's jaw-dropping shock. Damn it, pervy sage. Twinkling Cafe. Did you hear something? Both sisters looked to Marigold yet said nothing more than a no. As they returned to their meals in the cafe, they found refuge in from an essentially uncouth blonde. It was not a shelter from a brooding stalker, however, much to Hancock's annoyance and her sister's near ignorance. What he was exactly to their eldest sister they didn't know, though they knew this. While the blonde bonehead known as Naruto was a near constant grief to them as of late, and the man who used his headband as an eye patch of sorts was simply unlikable, it was he who held Hancock's disdain. As to the why, they couldn't place a finger on it, not yet at least. With finesse they finished what they had and left, thankfully not followed by Sasuke, who contented himself with watching them, Hancock specifically, go out the door and simply disappeared into the streets along with the crowds. So what do you think we should do now? Sandersonia all but sighed as she looked to the side to find something. Anything to help stave off the monotony brought on by their stop. To think that not having the bonehead around actually made things boring. How life was so interesting to ponder about at times. I don't know, I don't see, Marigold started. Marigold? Both sister turned to their sister to find her missing. The crowds were moving about as if nothing had happened at all, like their sister wasn't there at all. What the? Sandersonia started as well, only to be silenced as well. As with Marigold, Hancock turned to find her sister gone without a trace noticed either by her or cared for by the seemingly ignorant passers-by. While she couldn't care less of what the male half of the species cared for, those around her as a whole actually seemed unable to perceive her and her panicked plight. It was almost as if, jerking her gaze to the roofs in worry, she quickly spotted the smirking cause of the bizarre situation at hand. A man in what looked to be a custom blend of shinobi gear of a high-priced value and a clear bubble-like helmet had his hands frozen in a hand seal. A genjutsu style of a seal. A gloved hand armed with a rag clamped shut around Hancock's mouth long before the thought of screaming could reach her, not that it would have made a difference to an enchanted audience, bypassing the two as if they were just a combined obstacle that simply barred passage. In its own twisted way, however, Hancock received her answer as to what caused her sister's disappearance. Marketplace. The collective bead of sweat on the stand owner's head threatened to drop with each passing second that ensued between him and a blonde that glared at him as he slumped over the stands and rested, his chin against the wood as it were. To his relief, the standoff of an overall short haggle war between him and the child came to a close when the blonde sneered in anger, slammed the apparent remainder of his money on the table, and left with the only item he could afford. One enlarged dud of a snake egg. Sucker, he snickered as he counted the money as soon as he snatched it from its resting place. Meanwhile, with Naruto, all he could do was sullenly stare at the egg that took the last vestiges of his once proper fortune, for a genin at least, to purchase in what was already deemed a ludicrous bid to patch up the strained relationship between him and the sisters. The fact that all he could afford out of every form of shop he had happened across, he could only buy a snake egg that didn't hatch, did not help matters to say the least. With a resigned sigh, he leapt onto the roof of a nearby warehouse and leisurely strolled across it as he scrutinized the egg for any at all ideas as to how to make this proverbial olive branch more appealing to them. He could wrap it in tinfoil as a decoration. On second thought, no, that was outright lame even by lame's standards. Buff shine? Do eggs even shine to begin with, for that matter? Not worth the effort if that was the case. Doodle it with a marker. Another lame idea now that he thought about it. It's not like a marker could bring color to this lug of an egg like paint. That's it, not as grandiose as painting the Hokage monument, but it was a start, now to find some buckets of paint and creak. During which, warehouse. In the respective order of their abduction, the sisters awoke to their surroundings as dazed and confused as the situation warranted. Again, they found themselves behind bars, iron bars no less, in what appeared to be a musty warehouse that only seen more recent use as of late. Their kidnappers, just the two apparently, were in plain view, making no effort to hide themselves as they gathered around a table much too ornate for its surroundings and talked to themselves on what to do regarding their latest catch. Oh, how it brought a snarl to the lips of the sisters and a heavy-set glare at the ones at the table. As for Hancock, however, it was different, as she noticed a small detail before her sisters. There, proudly emblazoned on the shoulders of their uniforms, was what looked to be a large black circle with a following of detached triangles, 3 on top to form a claw, while one was the direct opposite of the middle one, to decorate the symbol. The hoof of the flying dragon, the personal symbol of those who called themselves the Celestial Dragons. Utter bastards, each and every one of them, since their inception, to even the minds of those who are living, breathing saints in the eyes of the world and their enemies. The only real thing they have going for them was money, pure and simple, to support their lifestyles and give them an iota of power in the world. With a smug grin that made them all the more despicable to the sisters, one of the goons got up from the table and strolled toward them in an undeniably condescending manner, as if he was gracing their lives with his presence. Creak. Crash. Ah. Wham! 4 sets of jaws dropped as one orange-clad blonde, clutching a giant snake egg for dear life, came crashing through the roof and utterly crushed the hapless Celestial in his haphazard landing. Stupid roof, Naruto groaned as he struggled to get up with his cargo in tow, carefully inspecting the egg in the process to ensure it wasn't harmed, since making his way across the roof while unaware of the downed man beneath him. Maybe if he was lucky, no one would pin this on him. Bonehead? So much for that plan. Maybe they would take a snake egg as compensation? Then again, that would shoot his already shaky at best plans to absolute. Wait. Twisting his head back, he came to gawk upon finding the Boa sisters in a cage, just as stunned as he was upon him, and likewise they were to suddenly learn of the other's presence. For a good long moment no one so much as breathed. Silence, however, much like rules at one point or another, is meant to be broken. What are you guys doing in a cage? It took all of Hancock's, Marigold's, and Sandersonia's sheer strength through willpower not to plant their faces along the wrought iron floor of their cell in equally matching dumbfounded shock of his need to question the situation as opposed to react to it. You insolent wretch! How dare you tread your filthy common feet upon the likes of royalty? Huh! Once more Naruto jerked his head to look upon a completely livid man in what appeared to be shinobi gear, fancy-looking one at that. Who are you and what are you talking about? Teeth gnashed in a vehement display of fury as the Celestial armed himself with a kunai of a glisteningly high quality that prompted Naruto into doing the same, though slowed by the awkwardness of the egg in his now one-armed clutch. I will show you your place, you vulgar peasant, he shouted, letting the kunai loose as he done so. Naruto steeled himself for what was to come, his face scrunched up in anticipation of combat as it usually was, only to fall slightly when the kunai came nowhere near where he was. It struck a crate and bounced off, but that was it. The Celestial across from him scowled as he armed himself with another kunai and threw it. Once more it missed as the knife bounced off the floor, this time as opposed to striking its intended target. Huh? Are you even trying? Naruto asked in disbelief, much to the sisters' growing amusement of the situation, as the Celestial across from them grew ever more red-faced in anger and embarrassment as he threw more and more kunai at the blonde with no success by any margin. The crates themselves would most likely be laughing at him at this point, as the most damage they received, if any, was a tiny nick or a dent at worst. Shut up! The Celestial barked with a heavy vein throbbing on his forehead. Once more he drew a kunai and held it aloft as if to wield it as THW weapon it was originally meant to be, as opposed to a projectile, yet even Naruto could tell the way he held it told the world he had no real experience of actually using the weapon as such. I'm not going to let some plebeian try to steal our rightful property. What are you talking about? I'm not trying to steal anything. Ha! No, 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 no. While she had no faith in men in general, she had at least some faith that he would willingly rescue them as the situation stood, but that trust went only so far as his ignorance in the matter lorded over everything else. She dove for the bars and put forth her body into slamming them to distract him, Naruto, or that bastard, if not both, long enough into forgetting each other for but a moment to somehow derail what the Celestial had to say. Her attack on the bars, however, were but a muted cough to the crystal-clear iteration of what she nor her sisters could not tolerate to hear any more. "Don't play dumb with me, you commoner. I know you came to steal our slaves." Hiss. "Well, maybe if you helped, I wouldn't have to bump into the walls to get to the kitchen." Hiss. "I'm hungry, you're hungry, let's agree on that much." "Do you think we should get Hancock to call off Salome now?" Marigold whispered to Sandersonia as they watched from around the corner as their younger brother bickered with the snake. "She's still reminiscing," the green-haired teen replied as she quietly munched on a bag of chips. "I knew I should have gotten the toad." A smirk played in unison on both sisters' lips. "Do you remember the day he met Salome for the first time?" The only thing missing that particular time was dinner for that show. Flashback. Celestial Dragon HQ, Warehouse, Josu. Fingers whitened to that of snow, faces paled to the bone that was underneath it, hearts thundered ominously, and what hoped quailed in silence of its own passing. It was out. Any fool that even lived underneath a rock knew the implication of being a slave of the celestial dragons. Live, die, escape, become a nun. The rumored experiments of the greatest villain that ever came from the Hidden Leaf Village are at least reasonably abhorred when so little of their robbed humanity remained if they were in his eyes a failure. Yet a slave of the celestial dragons were the freaks that were avoided. Slaves? On their own respective accords, their heads bowed. Yes. Slaves. He pointed the sisters in an all-too-eager, scornful smile. They're our property which was on loan to that pathetic commoner who claimed himself to be a lord, and we came to reclaim them now that they got free. A hand slowly drfted from the bars to the floor of the cage. In quiet mourning, it became an unclenched fist. "Just who the hell do you think you are?" All three heads snapped up at the demand to find Naruto snarling, or at least they assumed he was with his back to them given the slight hunch forward, at the now trembling but sneering Celestial. "Do you honestly think you guys are better than everyone else that you have to treat them like trash? People are not slaves, you bastard." He hunched over to a more noticeable degree. Shadow clone jutsu. Poof. What color there was to be had in a pasty individual who avoided the sun as best he could and even went so far as to try to keep himself from actually touching the world, be it the air or the dirt. It fell from his face far faster than his practically unhinged jaw when he came to recognize not one but over 80 of the orange-clad blondes now giving him the evil eye. Get him. As a tidal wave would unset rock, the man was consumed by the angered torrent of yellow and orange that swarmed him in a flurry of raised fists and swinging feet. Not the face. Not the face. Wah. It took a full moment for the downed Celestial to come to realize his bubble of a helmet was shattered, a fact to which he gasped in absolute horror as he came to realize he was breathing ordinary air. It was unacceptable. He leapt to his feet to find the one who had the gall to ruin his protection from the world's filthy air and found his gaze settling upon the massive pile of Narutos trying to get at something undoubtedly underneath their numbers. "You little." A kunai was drawn from its holster. "I'll make you pay, you insigne." Flump, and down he went, courtesy of a nonchalant Kakashi landing atop of him with an open copy of his favorite book in one hand. "Well, I suppose I made the right call in keeping an eye on Naruto," he mused as he watched the blocked-off mauling of the other Celestial who managed to get a scream loose here and there in between the shifting numbers. Not sure that it was necessary, he further commented as he looked to the defeated Celestial underneath him. He shrugged and resumed his reading. End flashback. Within her room, Hancock at long last closed her eyes and sighed a pleasant sigh as she finally laid the tarnished garment atop her bed. She edged slightly as she stretched her arms and then her back to work out the kinks that found themselves there before she rose up from her seat to make for the door. She stopped a good inch away from the need to reach out to grab the doorknob when her eyes skimmed across and settled upon a portrait that brought a dearer smile to her lips. It was of their time in Juso by some food stand a photographer had set up next to. She couldn't bring herself to remember what that stand hawked to the crowds. There she was towards the left of the photo, next to a somewhat nervous and paled Naruto eyeing a newborn Salome nervously while he coiled around her right arm in his own curiosity. Even blind men could see the amused smirk garnered from his dread of the snake at the time that was shared amongst the sister as the other two leaned and tilted towards the paranoid genin. She touched it affectionately in her passing. Flashback. The once proud Celestial now simply laid on the ground as a bloodied heap sporting more than enough bumps to accentuate the result of his one-sided skirmish with an army of clones. It was cold comfort at worst at least. The future, and likewise people, had a bad habit of surprising people for better or worse. The latter of which often being more memorable. Before the sullen sisters at a small distance was the genin of Konoha listening to a brief description of who it was he just faced. And there vested into the three sisters with but few details left out as an omission. None of them could tell if he was just trying to be merciful or cruel on his part. Not that they cared. Had the door not lay in a path that would have ensured some contact between the two of them, they would have left long beforehand. When the sound of sandals gently padding towards them did they officially focus their attention to the cause of it. It was the Naruto, still clutching the large egg to his chest, his face unreadable as he made his way to and stopped in front of them. Then he smiled. An unprovoked smile that they couldn't quite comprehend, but enjoyed regardless to a curious extent. Truce? He offered the egg to them with an ear-splitting, toothy grin. Crick. The egg began to jostle and crack along the top. Crick, crick crick, crack, HSSSS's. For the span of 2 seconds one Naruto Uzumaki came to have a staring contest with a newborn snake. Before freaking out, "Snake!" he cried as he mindlessly tossed it forward, jumped back over a crate, trip on said crate when his heel made contact with it as opposed to its counterparts rest on the floor, and cracked his head on the floor before rising up with a shaky kunai as his defense. "My, Naruto, I didn't know you were afraid of snakes," Kakashi remarked with a raised brow. "You try being swallowed up by one in your very first encounter and targeted by them ever since." An honest chuckle interjected at its own accord, and both shinobi turned to Hancock as she gently petted the snake with a sincere smile. A peaceful one. One that took a slightly darker edge when the eyes they belonged to gained a puckish quality as they settled on a gulping blonde. "So," she started as her grin became a bit more evil, "you're not a fan of snakes, are you?" She took a step forward, snake in tow by right of it curling around her hand, and observed the genin take an immediate 2 steps back. He was already out the door by the time she came to a sudden sprint. "Come back, Naruto. I don't think you've been properly introduced to Salome. Keep that snake away from me." Kakashi only shook his head in mild exasperation when the 2 remaining sisters joined in the chase that left him alone with the unconscious Celestials. "Kids," he rumbled as he grabbed the nearest piece of rope and snapped it to test its strength. "Well, this should do. A change of clothes and at most shampoo as a beauty product put to use." That was all it took to nearly everyone who wasn't at minimum a chunin, a mildly grizzled one at that thanks to 1 or 2 missions, falling head over heels for Hancock. With a little effort it reduced the general number of those who did resist her almost effortless power to charm others to the majority jonin in the village, the Hokage included of course. However, she learned that one the hard way thanks to an uncontrolled thought slipping from her lips when it became apparent she was not going to get her way. Old or not, she hits like a battering ram. Hancock seethed as she gingerly rested an ice pack upon the top of her forehead as she lay atop of her bed while wearing nothing more than a gray tank top and red shorts garnished with a small black stripe for each leg. Now I see why that knucklehead warned me about her. "Sister, we're back," Sandersonia announced upon the opening of the door, an arm laden with shopping bags with a similarly burdened Marigold a few steps away from her as they entered the room. "How'd the meeting with the Hokage?" Her voice left her as she gained a more decent view of her injured sister. "Oh dear God, what happened?" "She's really touchy about her age," Hancock groaned. "A violent old biddy, isn't she?" Marigold surmised as she frowned, setting her own collection of bags upon the opposing bed. "Grouchy too," Hancock grumbled. "So what did she say?" Sandersonia broached, earning an exasperated sigh from her sister in return. "According to her we're not eligible to become shinobi. We're too old for the training, as it were. At the most we can find some tutors but ultimately we're not going to be on their payroll as kunoichi. There goes our sure-shot big checks then." A sigh escaped Marigold as she traversed the room to an available chair to which she sat upon, hunching herself over with her elbows resting upon her knees and her hands come together in a steeple between mild frustration and contemplation. "We still have about 3 months left before we have to leave this hotel," she murmured. "True. Yet most of the villagers are falling head over heels for our big sister here," Sandersonia teased. Like before she earned a response from her sister, this time a semi-disgusted snort. "If there is one thing Naruto has above those drones is that he isn't a mindless sheep awed by beauty alone." A smirk played at her lips. Or cowed by that old hag at the least, she added with a dignified sneer to her tone. Speaking of which, wasn't he supposed to be with you at that meeting? To this Hancock adopted a smile that was a mix between impish, embarrassed, and mirthful all at once. I may have used him as a human shield when I talked about her age. Ooh. They cooed evilly with slightly sadistic grins. For a good moment they persisted till the realities of their situation came to inevitably bear itself upon their minds. I guess we should consider normal jobs then, seeing we can't get the high-paying ones. Hancock gave a silent blah as her eyes darkened in mild agitation, a sentiment shared by her younger sisters. I managed to get a good look in the want ads in a newspaper, Marigold half-heartedly groaned aloud. The only difference between them and what we used to do is that we finally get paid for the work. The audible blah with a small hint of venom to it came from Sandersonia this time, whereas Hancock settled for clenching her eyes shut and lightly grounding her teeth. Well, the village seems to be head over heels over our big sister, Sandersonia piped up. No, Both sisters turned to the eldest of the three on the bed. I can barely stand a few moments of them, let alone 5 minutes with those drones and men, she grumbled. I guess that just leaves us with either leaving town or get cozy with one of the shinobi, Marigold sighed. With the latter they were hard-pressed to name names that were met with approval. For the course of 20 minutes they either named or described shinobi they knew, the ones with connections or at least earned a decent living on their own merit especially. One by one they were whittled down, just one in particular. Why him? Because the other is an ass as far as I'm concerned. If worse comes to worse, we have Salome. He practically looks over his shit every minute to see if he's sneaking up on his shadow. True, so true, Sandersonia giggled a tad devilishly. Her delight washed away with time. But still, she intoned, you're not really giving so much as a half-second's worth of even considering otherwise, big sister. With a frown Hancock rolled herself onto her stomach, eyeing her sleeping pet snake that made its home in the corner whilst doing so, as she faced away from either sibling. He's more tolerable than most, she said quietly. We could still leave though once we have to vacate the hotel. We might even find better prospects outside of town. Hancock's lips twisted into a small, uncomfortable frown. I honestly feel safer here than out there. Sandersonia gave a quiet, exasperated sigh while Marigold contented herself with a mild roll of her eyes. With a sigh of her own, Hancock rolled back onto her back and got out of bed. Sister? I'm at least going to see if the option's open, he stated after a moment's hesitation that was masked by seemingly setting her mind to rifle through their closet for suitable wear. In the end she picked out a capri version of her shorts save for a black lotus image engraved at her left hip just before the black line. Finding a first aid kit she ended up planting a sizable amount of gauze over her bruise to hide it, and even then she obscured it as best as she could with her bangs. He's probably at that ramen place by now if he isn't at the hospital, Sandersonia half-sighed in a defeated fashion. Where is that place again? I think it's in that one place. Marigold spoke up only to mutter in the end, earning a smirk from her green-haired counterpart. The one with the people? She teasingly queried. Oh, shut up. Shaking her head, Hancock slipped on a pair of black socks and shoes before promptly slipping out of the door. Ichiraku ramen. Usually you're on your 6th bowl by now, Tucci commented as he gave Naruto numerous bandages wrapped around his head to the point it replaced his shinobi headband, a patch of gauze under his left eye whereas the other was blackened, his 4th bowl which he slowly ate in a slightly agitated silence. So there you are. He stopped in mid-slurp of a relatively small band of noodles to borderline glare at the familiar presence that claimed the seat next to him and fixed him in her own stare. He finished off the noodles at a sedate pace, raised the bowl to his lips and took his time to enjoy the broth inside it as opposed to continuing to eat its more solid contents. Slurp. She scowled slightly but held her tongue. All in all, this wasn't some unexpected event given what had happened. He might have even plotted out his revenge at this point, or at least was working on it at this very moment. Or perhaps she jump-started such a thought by simply announcing her presence, let alone sat so close to him. Her lip curled into a small frown as she relented and shunted those thoughts aside for the moment. Such thoughts weren't very productive in any case save for a paranoid defensive stratagem consisting of braining the blonde with a frying pan in a preemptive attack. stowing away her pride, sickening as it was, as well as a heavy, guttural sigh alongside the bile that wished to expel itself from the deepest recesses of her being. She bowed towards him in her seat, her head low. "I'm sorry." When she snapped like that, I acted without thinking and grabbed the first thing that looked like I could block those meteorites she called fists. She didn't look up. She didn't move an inch as her seemingly scrutinized her as far as she could tell. "Apology accepted. Here's fifths." "Thank you." By the time she looked up, she spotted the retreating form of a smirking man in a chef's outfit walking away with an empty bowl. Its replacement, of course, was being eagerly devoured by a revived Naruto whose half-buried face was turned towards the counter. A slight escaped Hancock and she shook her head slightly, her eyes rolling slightly as well whilst doing so. "So," she carefully spoke up, "I have a favor to ask you." He turned to her with stuffed cheeks that incrementally increased by a seemingly endless stream of noodles dredged up from the bowl. "You're aware of our current predicament, right?" He managed to mumble with a stuffed mouth. He swallowed it and devoured the train of noodles soon after to give her his full attention. "Well." She looked about her immediate surroundings to see if they were eavesdroppers. "As it stands now, we have no agreeable means of income short of demeaning ourselves," she bit out. "What do you mean, aren't there a bunch of jobs in the newspaper or something?" he asked with a perked up brow. She bit her lip to fight off an oncoming sneer. "Remember back in the..." Her sneer broke through at last for a brief moment, "old hag's office when I was trying to get my sisters and I to become Kunoichi of Konoha." Both a smirk and a frown fought for dominance on an otherwise ambiguous face. "Yeah," he answered carefully. "Well, between the money I heard and what you do for a living. Compared to that, everything else that seems available reminded me too much of what all three of us did before you met us." She looked away from him, partially obscuring the trembling, one-sided glower she fought to keep in check lest someone spotted it. Out of the corner of her eye she studied him as best as he could as his face became blank, though a slight frown of his own marred him, in contemplation. "So what exactly did you guys need help with?" She blew a silent, relieved sigh on her part as she turned to him with a suppressed smile. "We would like to stay with you once our time is up at the hotel." Her heart skipped a beat in fright as he turned away from her with an unmasked glower of an unknown origin upon his image, one which didn't disappear even as he worked to finish off his bowl's remaining contents. "Sixths. I'm not interrupting anything, am I?" "Nah. You're fine, old man." The chef shook his head slightly in mild exasperation as he left the bowl atop the counter before disappearing into the depths of the building-like stand. Slurping down the last remnants of his fifth bowl, he worked upon his sixth one with but a little hesitation on his behalf. "Not to say I can't help you, but I know Sasuke owns a lot of houses or something in the Uchiha district. Maybe if you ask him he'll give you one." "No," she said tersely enough to draw his full attention to her once more, utterly ignoring a hefty string of noodles and bits of fish cake stuck to them that was held hostage by his chopsticks. "Just..." She shook her to help find the words she wanted to say. "Something about him makes my skin crawl." Naruto gave her a confused frown. "He's my best friend, you know." "I just don't like him," she responded haughtily. A moment of silence ensued between the two that ended with Naruto sighing in defeat. "I don't have a lot of experience living with other people," he grumbled. "Been living by myself for as long as I can remember." "So is that a yes?" He sighed again in utter annoyance. "Yes." "Thank you," she answered warmly with a matching smile. "Whatever," he grumbled as he turned back to his bowl. Immediately he paled and froze himself in place. 7. Naruto. Why is there a giant snake eating your bowl inside my stand? Salome. That's not good for your health, Hancock chided. As for Naruto, all he could do was whimper pathetically as the large snake that had rapidly grown since its hatching swallowed his essentially untouched bowl of ramen. It was just unacceptable. Despite being a man, he lived with surprisingly hygienic standards, thus that was not an issue. No, it was far worse than that. That apartment would be cramped for 2 people, let alone 4. And while she couldn't say she was entirely surprised, but despite her efforts there was surprising resistance from real estate agencies towards any idea of letting her family stay in so much as an apartment without some form of compensation, regardless if Naruto lived with them or not. Yet what really rankled her was that whenever Naruto's name came up, said agents suddenly lost interest. The nerve! Yet unfortunately, or fortunately if she played her cards right, This was more of a civil matter than one that concerned the Hokage, who Naruto had some leeway with, however debatable that was. Short of an emergency, she wasn't likely to be involved in anything further than finalizing the documents regarding this, if at all. At any rate, however, by going over the agency's heads, her family would either have a roof over their heads, or at least she would be more knowledgeable of this. Stigma was concerning Naruto since he hadn't been any help himself. The council may see you now. There were a total of 3 councils in Konoha. The Konoha Council, ultimately advisors to the Hokage and nothing more. The Grand Council, a calling of heads of state, heads of notable families and essentially leaders amongst the civilian populace during times of discretion, such as the village being on the precipice of a war or other equally delicate matters, and the Civil Council. Whereas the other 2 handle the day-to-day actions of shinobi more so than the Civil Council, they were the ones who handled the domestic life of Konoha, short of the Hokage attending to it herself. If there was one way to go above the agencies and Odd Bank's issue with housing, then it was them. Ah yes, Miss Boa. As we understand it, you're having issues getting a residence within Konoha? The council as it stood was of 6 people ranging from young men and women to middle-aged at worse. Most of which, however, were male, leaving only 2 women to make up their number. It was a small room they were in, all things considered, with no windows and at best 2 doors, one being the main entrance whilst the other lead elsewhere. They all sat behind a long table adorned with a floor-length tablecloth and faced the primary door into the room. Before them sat a small table in the company of a lone chair. A low wall and a handful of pews sat just behind that, with only a single path to divide the section. Yes, she answered simply after she took her seat before them. She looked to them as if to ensure she saw what she saw, and forced down a grin of spotting a few of her admirers in the group before her. I actually took the liberty to look into your case before our meeting here, one said as he pulled up a folder hidden from underneath his end of the table and promptly opened it. You're from the Spring Country, correct? Not originally, she admitted, her hand ducking beneath the table to uneasily grasp at her dress, whereas the rest of her was calm. My sisters and I were originally from an island far to the south. We were on a cruise to the elemental nations when we were abducted, and... She sniffed, turned and cupped her face as her head canted forth in shame. Forced into slavery. She grinned a tad evilly beneath her hands as it had the desired effect of garnering gasps all around, even a few outraged cries from her admirers. For years we toiled under master after master, enduring hardship and wanton lust till we were freed from our latest owner, Dodo of the late land of snow. Sniff. We came to Konoha on the promise of a better life, and while the Hokage was kind enough to offer us a hotel. Sniff. We can't find a job that doesn't remind us of our recent life, where the only luxury we had were the manacles on our wrists. And our time at the hotel is running out, and... She pitched forward and cried harder. We'll end up on the streets before we know it. And the outside world is so scary. I can't help but fear for my sisters and myself, since no one is offering to help in the least. As she went into hysterics, she parted a finger enough to see the council had huddled together, heads hung low and the folder being used as a makeshift barrier. She couldn't help but grin a little once more when they simultaneously nodded in agreement. She jutted her finger back in place before they returned their attention to her. Miss Boa. With an actor's slowness she stood straighter in her chair and turned to them, her face as distraught as she willed it with masterfully hidden glee. I believe we may have 2 solutions to your problem. Sitting up straight, the apparent leader of the group. The Uchiha district has long since been empty save for the occasional squatter or 2 patrols catch on a monthly basis. Yet ultimately it's the last descendant of the clan who has a say in the matter. If you speak to him, then I'm sure he'll be generous. Excuse me, Hancock interrupted, her lip trembling as she dabbed at her eyes with her hand. I appreciate the effort, but... Sniff, but he scares me. Only one actually looked incredulous, insulted even, by her tearful remark, yet before he could open his mouth to counter, a cohort of his clamped her hand around his mouth. We understand, she laughed. But frankly that's the easier of the 2. Oh. Hancock dabbed another tear away. Ha ha. Yes. Though she tried to smile, yet it was heavily marred by a grimace to such a degree she turned to the others for help. Really, there's a complication with the second option that's been in effect since the Third War, instated by the third Hokage himself as a law. The councilman scratched his cheek as he looked away in embarrassment. On a side note, government funds are still being used today towards its maintenance out of respect of a fallen ally of Konoha, also a law instated by the late third Hokage. Oh, it was another member of the council to speak up. The complication is that you must be a legitimate member of the Uzumaki clan to inhabit it. Since the homeland of the clan was destroyed, its survivors scattered, it seemed like a good idea at the time for the Uzumaki to have a rally point, if you will, with friends and family. To help limit attempts on them, it's basically forbidden for non-members of the clan to reside there for an extended period of time, like say 2 or 3 days at the uttermost. He looked expectantly towards another who cleared his throat in return before assuming the role. Fortunately, there is one who happens to still be in the village, yet he paused for a moment. Not very deserving of it. He looked to a member closest to the end of the table who nodded in return, armed herself with red folder, got up and made her way to a puzzled Hancock. By that you mean? She accepted the folder and looked inside to find adoption papers held within. Well, one started to say, only to struggle. He's crass, yes, and he's loud, a demented prankster. Violent to boot, correct, and he's dim-witted. True. So true, wouldn't know a vowel from an adjective even if he was mauled by one. Anyway, a councilwoman spoke up, it shouldn't be too difficult to dupe him into signing that. Then you can live in luxury without him being any the wiser. I see. She almost said too quietly. She closed the folder and stood up. She bowed politely towards the council and left without a second glance, effectively hiding away the slight scowl on her face as the members packed up their belongings and left. Hey, wait a minute. Yes? Everyone turned to the councilman as he intently stared at his reopened folder. It seems she has a keen interest to live with the boy. Silence. For what seemed like ages, Naruto stood there in clear view of the front door, he and his newly ordained sisters, having just passed the front gate. Hung over his shoulder and held there by his hand was a small rucksack filled to the brim and then some with a little over half of his possessions, namely clothing. In his spare hand was the picture of a smiling red-headed woman in kunoichi garb of Konoha. Uneasily he looked up at the sole building within the property and frowned, albeit without thought to it. At a clack coming from the gate behind him, he managed to wipe away his subconscious grimace for a more conscious, curious frown out of pure instinct as he faced his sisters as they, through combined effort on their part, slammed the gate shut to cut off the horde of Hancock's admirers. Phew! Marigold happily exclaimed as she gratefully leaned back against the gate. You really need to lay off or lay low for the next few days, big sister, she rasped. Yeah. Sandersonia held up a white t-shirt showcasing the eldest of the three, merely flinging her hair back as she unwittingly passed by the camera that took it. Your fanbase is getting creepier by the day, she deadpanned. Up until now you two haven't been complaining, Hancock countered in a huff as she turned away, flinging her hair in the process much like she had done in the picture. Yes, well, we didn't have a house they wanted to break into, Sandersonia cried in exasperation. I think I hear some of them whispering about that right now, Marigold whispered in a conspiratorial manner whilst her ear was fervently pressed against the gate. At least they got all our stuff neatly placed in little rows, Hancock pointed out, both figuratively and literally, to the assorted rows, each belonging to one of the 4 siblings. Hey guys, are you going to argue all day or am I gonna have to explore the house myself? Naruto asked, just short of a yell due to the distance between himself, now at the door, and them. Just a second. With a sigh she looked around her current surroundings for both inspection and contemplation. Seeing a shadowed head popping up from behind on the wall, she scowled, grabbed a random high heel from one of her hundreds of shopping bags and flung it with dire accuracy at the figure. To her satisfaction the shoe bounced off the stalker's head, knocking down from the wall with a satisfying and surprisingly loud oof. Inside, 10 minutes later, homely was a word for it if the dust was to be ignored, the sheets over all the furniture forgotten. The fact that no one had lived here for nearly 30 years, give or take, a side note. They certainly weren't lying in saying that it was maintained over the years for what it's worth. In the end though, homely as it was reminiscent to a tomb, given that the electricity failed to power the lights despite the notice that went to the company responsible for it. The fact that there was absolutely no sign of being lived in had equally hampered the mood. They could only guess if it was by design of a meticulous hand that didn't care for the results, or if had been no residents to date, squatters included, aside from one Kushina Uzumaki. Sort of a shame, all things considered, due to a technicality caused by taking the name of another due to marriage. the identity of whom she married was strangely enough missing altogether despite numerous and thorough expeditions into the archives by Shizune plus the staff at hand. She was no longer able to live within the compound as she pleased since she was no longer considered to be a Uzumaki under the eyes of the law. Regardless, it was off-putting to say the least for the last Uzumaki, by blood and another technicality by law, within Konoha. For once it wasn't due to his current circumstances. Or rather not in regards of living by himself nor with being with people who barely surpassed being strangers to him, while he wasn't exactly thrilled to learn what was in effect a birthright withheld from him for so many years. Not that he would have done much with it if he was honest with himself, but for once there was at least some light shed on who his parents were. Granted it was only his mother and limited information to that effect, but it was something. Still, he would have liked to know more though, other than the fact she was a kunoichi at one point in time of course. Geez, you're jumpy, Marigold grumbled as she and Sandersonia essentially kidnapped him from what he claimed as his room, photo still in his startled grasp. Just what are you guys doing? He indignantly cried as he tried to wiggle himself out of their grasp. No way we're going to have you gloomy on the first night, Sandersonia answered with a vindicated grin. That aside, what better way to celebrate moving in than going out for dinner? Marigold elaborated. BRT. About time, Sandersonia grumbled as they stopped so she could sternly eye a nearby miscellaneous lamp. Did you two get Naruto? Hancock called out, coming? Even while Naruto grumbled about his predicament, Hancock could only shake her head in amusement when they entered the foyer. Come on, come on. Beautiful as I am, I doubt the ritzier restaurants would upend their clients on my say-so, she royally commanded as she ushered them towards the door. Ichiraku's doesn't get a lot of crowds at night, Naruto offered with a sly grin. We're definitely going to have to set some ground rules here, Marigold commented as they sauntered through the door. Again shaking her head, Hancock made for the door with a small smile on her lips. While she opened the door and subsequently turned herself around whilst closing it, her eye caught a glimpse of light at the end of the hallway before her, her curious gaze falling on the mirror situated to greet all those who may come and go through the front door. Her lip curled into a gentle smile as she examined herself. Gone were the shackles that once bound her wrists and ankles. Her ragged clothing replaced and her skin, paled by the lack of light and proper nourishment, held a more graceful, beaming radiance of healthy alabaster. But most of all, as opposed to a scowl that would often visit her, there for her to see was an honest smile. Caught within the mirror's view were her sisters, equally changed and happier for it. Upheld by the scruff of his jumpsuit in Sandersonia's grasp was a sulking Naruto, his lips puffed out in a pout and his arms crossed across his chest. Though her smile vanished upon the closing of the door and replaced with a dignified, haughty huff, she never lost its feeling as she regally wiped her hair behind her as she marched towards the gate. End flashback. Taking in a gentle breath and releasing it in a quiet sigh, she steeled herself in her typical regal demeanor just before crossing the threshold of the foyer. Naruto, what have I told you about playing with Salome? With a dark, deadpan stare he raised his head to glare at her. We both know how this started, he growled. HMPH. She easily strode past the two of them and nabbed a designer coat from a coat rack. Above it she claimed a pair of stylish purple high heels to match her dress. As she drew nearer to the door she let loose a curt whistle that commanded her pet to unravel itself from his captive to join her at her side. Sonia. Mari. We're going out tonight. She turned her head to glance to Naruto. You may as well get dressed too. Having managed to stand up as she called for their sisters, Naruto leveled irritable glare at her as he crossed his arms. And why should? He cut himself off as Hancock evilly smiled as she nonchalantly waved a key in her clutch. The sole key he kept to keep his private stash of ramen safe, for the most part to be precise. Fine. He turned and marched away. Not like it's gonna make a difference. He grumbled to himself, unaware of the even more evil smirk on Hancock's visage as she hidden it away by facing the door. With a puckish grin she deliciously counted the seconds since Naruto left the foyer whilst she tucked the ramen key into a purse. To her disappointment she heard nothing akin to unadulterated horror or at best anger as minutes later her sisters finally arrived for luxurious dinner. You are aware this means war, right? Naruto announced from around the corner. Are you coming or not? Hancock calmly demanded without tearing her gaze from the door. Oh, I'm coming, he grumbled, his sisters unaware of the sinister smile on his face as he stepped into view with a balloon filled, to his delight, paint of his choosing. The end. Now we will see you in the next video.